The day had started like any other. I had trudged through lectures, notes crammed haphazardly into my backpack, my mind half on the material and half on the looming deadlines. But when I stepped into her classroom that afternoon, the world seemed to shift just slightly, enough for me to notice it even if no one else did. She was there, of course, standing near her desk with that quiet, composed presence that always seemed to draw attention without demanding it. The air around her carried a subtle warmth, tinged with the faint scent of her perfume, something like soft vanilla mixed with the crisp hint of old books. I tried to focus on the task at hand, collecting assignments, answering questions, but she had a way of commanding attention without words. Today, though, there was something different in her gaze. It wasn't stern, nor particularly playful. It was deliberate. She met my eyes across the room, and for a fleeting moment, it felt like she was looking right through me, reading the hesitation, the curiosity, and perhaps a quiet longing I hadn't admitted even to myself. When the other students shuffled out, I lingered near the door, pretending to organize my notes, pretending not to notice the way her presence seemed to fill the room. And then she spoke, her voice lower than usual, smooth but firm, curling around my name as though it had been waiting there all along. If you want to pass, you'll have to learn to follow my every command, starting tonight. Her words landed gently but firmly, and I could feel a shiver of both apprehension and intrigue travel up my spine. There was no levity in her tone, no joking smile to soften the weight of her statement, just that calm, unshakable certainty that made it impossible to ignore. I swallowed, my mouth dry, and my heart betrayed me with a sudden, sharp beat. She stepped closer, and for a moment, all I noticed was the soft swish of her skirt, the subtle warmth radiating from her as she leaned slightly toward me. The world outside the classroom seemed to blur, the hum of fluorescent lights, the distant chatter in the hallway, and I found myself hyper-aware of small, intimate details. The way her hand rested lightly on the edge of the desk, the almost imperceptible brush of her fingers against my notebook, the slight dip of her head as she studied me. I wanted to speak, to ask what she meant, to protest politely, but my voice caught somewhere between caution and fascination. Instead, I nodded, almost imperceptibly, as if conceding to a silent understanding I didn't yet fully comprehend. Her lips curved into a faint, knowing smile, and she straightened, stepping back just enough to restore the professional distance. But the air between us still hummed with unspoken tension. As I left the classroom, my mind raced with questions I couldn't voice and a pull I couldn't resist. That simple offer, framed as a challenge, felt heavier than any lecture, more potent than any assignment. And for the first time, I realized that the lessons she might teach tonight could be unlike anything I had ever learned before. Lessons not just in study, but in attention, restraint, and something far more elusive, trust and connection. That evening, I found myself standing outside her apartment door, heart hammering in my chest as if it were trying to announce my arrival before I even knocked. The hallway smelled faintly of polished wood and a lingering hint of lavender, and the soft glow of a single lamp behind her door made the world feel smaller, more intimate. I could hear the quiet shuffle of papers inside before she opened the door herself, dressed simply yet elegantly, as if her presence alone could make the room feel alive. "Come in," she said, her voice low and smooth, carrying the authority I had always respected in class but now tinged with something warmer, more inviting. I stepped inside, and the door closed behind me with a soft click, cutting me off from the ordinary world outside. The room smelled faintly of coffee and old books, with a subtle undertone of her perfume, the same scent that had drawn my attention all semester. Lamps cast pools of gentle light across the shelves, illuminating stacks of notebooks and papers in warm, inviting hues. We sat at her small, tidy desk, papers spread between us, the faint scratch of pen on paper filling the pauses. Her eyes watched me closely, noticing my hesitation, my uncertainty, and she leaned slightly forward, the curve of her shoulder brushing mine ever so lightly as she adjusted a sheet of notes in front of me. That tiny, almost imperceptible touch sent a strange warmth racing up my arm, a reminder that I was closer to her than I'd ever been before. "Start with this problem," she said softly, pointing at the page. "Follow my instructions carefully, step by step. There was no harshness in her tone, only a quiet insistence that made it clear she expected attention, focus, and obedience. My hands moved almost automatically, tracing the numbers, following her voice as it guided me. Occasionally, our fingers brushed as she corrected my grip on the pen or pointed to a calculation, and each contact lingered slightly longer than necessary. My heart raced, but there was something soothing in her proximity, a steadiness that invited both concentration and curiosity. As we worked, she occasionally leaned close to whisper corrections, her warm breath brushing my ear, and I found myself caught between wanting to look away and craving the closeness. Her shoulder pressed lightly against mine when she adjusted my posture, and for a moment, I felt a quiet steadiness in her presence, like a gentle anchor in the chaos of my thoughts. I realized that the instructions were more than just academic. They were subtle lessons in attentiveness, in noticing nuance, in following her rhythm as much as her words. The tension wasn't loud or dramatic. It was a soft, constant undercurrent, like the hum of a familiar tune you can't stop listening to. Every glance, every gentle touch, every whispered correction built a delicate intimacy I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. My usual confidence in problem-solving was replaced by a quiet eagerness to follow her guidance, to absorb not just the lesson, but the sense of trust and focus she demanded, and gave in return. By the time the session ended, the room felt smaller, warmer, and somehow charged with a quiet understanding. As I stood to leave, she gave a small, knowing smile, her eyes lingering on mine, and I felt a pull I couldn't resist, the realization that this was only the beginning. Tonight, the lesson had been about math or logic, perhaps, but also about presence, connection, and the subtle power of following her lead. And I knew, with a certainty that both thrilled and unnerved me, that I was eager for the next one. The days after that first evening seemed to blur together, each one colored by the lingering memory of her presence. In class, I caught myself stealing glances, noticing the way she moved with effortless grace, the way her eyes seemed to quietly assess not just my answers, but my hesitation, my eagerness, my very demeanor. Each glance sparked a flutter I didn't fully understand, and each time she smiled softly at a question I answered correctly, it felt like an acknowledgement of something unspoken, something far more personal than academics. One afternoon, she invited me to walk with her to her office after class, ostensibly to discuss my recent assignments. The corridor felt unusually quiet, the hum of distant chatter fading as we moved. I was acutely aware of every small detail, the soft tap of her heels on the floor, the gentle sway of her hair as she turned her head to speak, the warmth radiating from her coat brushing mine as we walked side by side. It was intoxicating and disorienting at once. I wanted to maintain distance, to remind myself of propriety, yet every instinct urged me to lean closer, to linger in her orbit. When we reached her office, she gestured for me to sit across from her at the desk. The space between us was small but charged. As she bent over a paper to correct a note, our knees brushed lightly under the desk, sending an unexpected jolt through me. Her hand hovered for a moment longer than necessary on the edge of mine as she pointed to a margin note. I felt a heat rise to my cheeks and struggled to focus on the assignment rather than the sensation of proximity, the subtle thrill of contact. I found myself thinking about the age difference more than I had anticipated. She carried the weight of experience with effortless elegance, and I was acutely aware of the gap between us. Not just in years, but in the quiet confidence, in the life stories hinted at in the lines of her smile and the gentleness in her voice. It should have intimidated me, and part of it did. Yet there was also a magnetic pull, an unspoken invitation to step closer, to trust her guidance in ways that extended beyond academics. Her voice broke through my thoughts, low and steady as she offered advice on approaching a complex problem. The words themselves were simple, but the cadence, the warmth, the attention behind them felt profoundly personal. I realized that my hesitation, the constant back and forth between propriety and curiosity, was exactly the tension she seemed to notice and perhaps, quietly, encourage. By the time I left, I was mentally exhausted yet exhilarated. Confusion mingled with anticipation, propriety with desire, and I couldn't stop replaying the moments of subtle contact, the lingering glances, the quiet authority she wielded without ever raising her voice. I knew this attraction was complicated, socially delicate, morally ambiguous, and emotionally intense. Yet there was a part of me, undeniably, that wanted to follow her lead, to lean into the magnetic tension, to see where this quiet, unspoken connection could go. As I walked back across campus, my thoughts kept returning to her, to the soft press of her shoulder, the lingering warmth of her hand, and the way her eyes seemed to measure me with both expectation and curiosity. I realized that the real lesson wasn't only in the assignments or the tutoring. It was in understanding how close you could stand to someone, how carefully desire could be balanced with respect, and how slowly, almost imperceptibly, the heart could begin to follow a command it had never heard before. That evening, the library felt different from any place I had known. The dim, golden lamplight pooled over rows of books, casting long, intimate shadows that seemed to cocoon the corner where we sat. Outside, the hum of campus life had faded to nothing, leaving only the soft scratch of pen on paper and the occasional rustle of pages. I felt her presence more acutely than ever. Her quiet confidence, her measured movements, the faint perfume lingering in the air around her. She gestured for me to sit closer, her voice low but deliberate. Focus on this problem. Follow my guidance exactly. There was no harshness, no demand. Just a quiet, unshakable authority that drew me in. As I leaned over the paper, I felt the soft brush of her shoulder against mine. The touch was fleeting, casual in appearance, yet it carried a weight I could feel in my chest. My pulse quickened, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation that made concentrating on the numbers a subtle challenge. Her hand hovered over mine as she pointed out an equation, adjusting my grip slightly on the pen. The warmth of her fingers against mine lingered, a gentle yet insistent reminder of proximity. I was acutely aware of every movement. The tilt of her head, the cadence of her voice, the way her eyes held mine for a fraction longer than necessary. The moment felt suspended, a delicate balance between focus and fascination, between obedience and curiosity. Occasionally, she would lean forward to whisper corrections, her breath brushing my ear. Each time, I felt a shiver run down my spine, not from fear or impropriety, but from the subtle intimacy of shared attention. It was a closeness that demanded focus, yes, but also invited trust. Trust in her guidance, in her expectations, in the unspoken rhythm she seemed to set for the evening. The challenge wasn't just the academic exercise. It was navigating the tension, the unspoken acknowledgement of our connection, the quiet electricity that hummed in the space between us. I wanted to respect boundaries, to maintain composure, yet there was a thrill in following her lead, in responding to her instructions with both concentration and a heightened awareness of her nearness. Each subtle brush, each deliberate pause, each shared glance was a lesson in attentiveness, in presence, and in restraint. As the session progressed, I noticed small shifts in myself. My breathing slowed when her hand lingered lightly on mine. My heartbeat quickened when her gaze met mine in those silent, measured moments. She seemed to sense it, offering encouragement through tone, posture, and the faintest, almost imperceptible smiles. It was a lesson in more than problem-solving. It was a lesson in awareness, in connection, and in the subtle art of yielding without losing oneself. By the time we concluded the session, a quiet warmth had settled between us. There were no overt declarations, no dramatic gestures, only the shared understanding of what had passed in those few hours. I left the library with a strange mixture of exhilaration and introspection, realizing that the challenge she had set wasn't just academic. It was personal, emotional, and profoundly intimate in its subtlety. And though I didn't fully understand it yet, I knew that the next lesson would not only test my mind, but also the delicate thread of trust and attention that had begun to form between us. The following evening, she invited me to her apartment again, not for tutoring in the traditional sense, but to help her organize some old study materials she had been meaning to sort. It was casual enough to seem harmless, yet I felt the familiar flutter in my chest as I stepped inside, sensing the warm, intimate atmosphere that had become a silent signature of these encounters. The lamps cast gentle, flickering light over piles of papers, and the faint aroma of vanilla and polished wood enveloped me. The room felt both private and inviting, a small world where the outside could no longer intrude. She handed me a stack of notebooks, her fingers brushing mine briefly, just long enough to leave a spark of warmth. I noticed the subtle movements that made her presence so magnetic. The tilt of her head when she spoke, the quiet confidence in the way she arranged the papers, the softness of her voice when she whispered a small joke about a mislabeled notebook. I found myself wanting to linger on these details, memorizing each nuance like a lesson I didn't want to forget. As we worked, she began to speak of herself in small, hesitant fragments. Stories from years past, moments of pride, and quiet regrets she had never shared with anyone. Her voice softened, a fragile layer beneath the composed exterior I always admired. There was a pause after each confession, a delicate silence where her gaze met mine, searching for understanding. I realized, then, that this was more than tutoring, more than a challenge. It was a lesson in trust, in shared humanity, and in recognizing vulnerability without judgment. At one point, as she reached across to steady a stack of books, our hands touched, lingering in a warm, gentle clasp. The contact was brief, yet it carried a weight I could feel in my chest. It wasn't just the physical warmth. It was the comfort of knowing she trusted me enough to allow closeness, even in such mundane tasks. My fingers hesitated for a moment, then relaxed, holding hers lightly, as if acknowledging that this small gesture said more than words ever could. We laughed quietly over an old notebook that contained scribbled notes from a lecture long past. The sound of her laughter was soft and melodic, filling the space between us with an intimacy I hadn't expected. I leaned slightly closer to share in the moment, and she didn't pull away. Instead, she tilted her head, letting our eyes meet for a heartbeat longer than necessary, and I felt the unspoken understanding that we were no longer merely teacher and student, but two people exploring a connection that was quietly growing in depth and intensity. By the end of the evening, the room felt charged yet safe, intimate yet respectful. There were no dramatic gestures, no overt declarations, only the quiet resonance of shared vulnerability. I left with a deep awareness that these evenings were transforming me, shaping my understanding of trust, affection, and emotional closeness. And I knew that the bond forming between us was delicate, requiring patience and sensitivity, yet profoundly compelling in its slow, inexorable pull. In that subtle, almost imperceptible way, I realized that this lesson was not about books or exams at all. It was about learning to be present, to notice the details, and to respond with empathy and attentiveness, the foundations of a connection that might, in time, become something far more enduring and tender than I had ever imagined. The rain started softly that evening, a quiet patter against the window panes that seemed to echo the rhythm of my own heartbeat. She had invited me to sit with her near the large bay window in her study, where the world outside was blurred by streaks of silver and gray. The room was dim, illuminated only by the warm glow of a single desk lamp and the soft reflection of streetlights on wet pavement. The atmosphere was intimate, private, a cocoon where time seemed to slow, and every sound, every glance, carried weight. We sat side by side on the wide window seat, a thick blanket draped over our legs. The air was thick with unspoken words, the space between us charged with anticipation. I was acutely aware of her presence, the warmth radiating from her body, the subtle scent of her perfume mingling with the fresh petrichor from the rain, the soft rise and fall of her breathing as she studied the notes in front of us. Every slight movement, a tilt of her shoulder, a turn of her head, the faint brush of her hand against mine, sent a ripple of awareness through me. She leaned closer to point out a passage in my notes, her voice dropping slightly, soft and melodic. The warmth of her breath brushed against my ear, and I felt a shiver, not of fear, but of recognition of the delicate tension that had been building over weeks. My hand brushed hers as I reached for the same page, and we paused, fingers resting lightly together. That small contact, though fleeting, felt monumental. It was an acknowledgement of closeness, a silent admission that the unspoken bond between us had deepened. For the first time, our gazes met without distraction, lingering in a shared understanding. I realized that the lessons she had been teaching were no longer solely about academics or obedience. They were about trust, presence, and the courage to acknowledge feelings that were quietly, persistently stirring between us. The age difference, the societal expectations, the caution I had felt. All of it seemed to fade in the warmth of the moment, leaving only the raw, unspoken connection. She tilted her head slightly, and for a heartbeat, I felt the unguarded vulnerability that she had allowed me to glimpse before, now fully present between us. I wanted to reach out, to convey everything I felt without words, but instead I let my hand rest lightly on hers, a gesture of understanding and reassurance. Her fingers tightened subtly in response, and that gentle squeeze spoke volumes. Mutual acknowledgement, mutual respect, mutual desire tempered with care. The rain continued outside, rhythmic and soothing, as if the world itself had slowed to honor the intimacy between us. We didn't need to speak. The silence was full of meaning. That night, I understood that the connection we had nurtured, the slow, careful build of trust, attention, and subtle intimacy, had reached a point where desire could exist alongside respect, and longing could coexist with patience. When I finally left, the warmth of her hand in mine lingered in my mind, along with the quiet certainty that whatever path lay ahead, it would be walked with intention, care, and a deep, tender understanding. The lesson had shifted from obedience to connection, and I knew, without doubt, that it was one I would never forget. The morning light filtered gently through her study windows, casting soft, golden patterns across the room. The stacks of books and scattered papers from previous night's sessions seemed less chaotic now, more like a testament to the time we had spent together, shared moments of learning, attention, and quiet intimacy. I found her seated at the desk, reviewing notes with her usual calm focus, and for a moment, I simply watched, appreciating the serene authority she carried with such natural ease. "Good morning," she said softly, glancing up and offering a faint smile. There was warmth there, an acknowledgement of everything that had passed between us in the weeks prior. I smiled back, feeling the quiet thrill of connection that no words could fully capture. As I stepped closer to sit beside her, I realized how comfortable it felt. This closeness that had built slowly, deliberately over time. My shoulder brushed hers as I reached for a notebook, and she didn't move away. Instead, she leaned just slightly, a subtle, unspoken affirmation that our shared space had become a place of trust and companionship. We spent the morning reviewing our notes, but the conversation meandered naturally beyond academics. We spoke of small joys, of memories from our lives outside the classroom, laughing softly at shared observations and gentle jokes. There was a rhythm to the exchange, a quiet harmony that came from weeks of attention, observation, and mutual respect. Our hands occasionally brushed while turning pages, and each touch, light, fleeting, and entirely appropriate, carried the warmth of familiarity and connection. At one point, she paused, placing her hand lightly over mine as I reached for a pen. The gesture was simple, yet it spoke volumes. A quiet acknowledgement of the trust and intimacy we had cultivated. My heart swelled, not with urgency, but with a calm, steady affection. I realized that this was the culmination of our slow-burn journey, not a dramatic confession, but the quiet, profound knowledge that we were seen, understood, and appreciated by one another. We lingered over a final page of notes, the sunlight catching in her hair and creating a halo of warmth that mirrored the feeling in my chest. There was no rush, no need for grand declarations. The room was filled with a gentle, comforting presence, the kind that comes from deep emotional understanding and the unspoken promise of continued closeness. As I prepared to leave, our hands met briefly in a soft, lingering touch. Our eyes held one another's for a moment longer than necessary, sharing a silent agreement that the connection we had nurtured was real, meaningful, and worth tending to. I felt a profound sense of peace, of fulfillment, and of anticipation for the quiet, intentional journey ahead. Walking out into the bright morning, I carried with me the warmth of our shared mornings, the subtle intimacy of our touches, and the knowledge that the bond we had built, with patience, respect, and gentle care, was a rare and enduring one. In her presence, I had learned more than lessons from textbooks. I had learned about attention, trust, and the beauty of a connection that grows slowly, tenderly, and entirely on its own terms. And for the first time, I felt that such a bond could last, not because of the intensity of a single moment, but because of the steady, careful, and affectionate journey we had walked together. Sparkles, if you felt the tension and warmth of this slow-burn romance. Hit like and subscribe for more stories of unexpected connections and age-gap love. Share your thoughts in the comments. Would you follow her every command?